All right, this is your Chapter 3, Section 4 presentation. And in this section, we're taking a look at how cooperative federalism led to the growth of the national government. So we're going to answer the essential question, which asks just that. How did cooperative federalism lead to the growth of the national government? So now we're talking about the era of the New Deal, an era a lot of you are very familiar with. Dual federalism ended for good in the 1930s. Yes, the 16th and 17th Amendments expanded the role of the national government and chipped away at dual federalism, but the Great Depression sparked the true demise of dual federalism. Economic events that led to the Great Depression and therefore the end of dual federalism were the bank failures of the 1920s, the crash of the agriculture industry in 1921, the demise of the construction industry in 1926, the fact that by 1929, consumer and automobile inventories were at an all-time high, and they were having difficulty selling them. And then on October 29th, 1929, the crash of the stock market. The presidents at that time, when these events were taking place, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, did very little to address the problems. They thought that the National Depression was an amalgamation of the state economic crisis, and that it was best to be dealt with by state and local governments. Their optimism about the ability of state and local governments to solve this crisis by 1933 was dashed, and the situation at this point couldn't be ignored. And so FDR comes into the picture at this point. He is elected president in 1932. He's inaugurated in 1933, and he immediately begins to act in a new way which is going to alter the balance of power between the federal and state governments by creating a series of new federal agencies in what we now call the New Deal. Often these agencies would be known by their initials. Some examples of these agencies are the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, which creates federal financing for new home construction. The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corp. Later would be added the WPA, which would do something very similar, created work relief programs for farmers and homeowners. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which imposed restrictions on agriculture and many industries while also providing subsidies to farmers. The New Deal basically forces all levels of government to work together to implement these programs. Big cities actually start to take a prominent role in national politics because FDR, number one, wants support of the democratic political machines, and because they could often be used as a way to bypass the conservative state legislatures. This makes cities a player in national politics for the first time. The New Deal programs enlarge the scope of the national government, and with the growth in power, you also see challenges or pushback from more conservative elements, and they do so through the courts. So through the 1930s, the court had ruled that certain aspects through the early 1930s, the court was ruling that certain aspects of New Deal programs went beyond Congress's Commerce Clause powers. That Congress and with FDR's backing were exceeding their authority under Commerce Clause power, and therefore the court was ruling a lot of provisions of the New Deal unconstitutional. These rulings reflected the court's laissez-faire, hands-off philosophy during this era. FDR becomes so frustrated with the courts and their pushback to his New Deal that he suggests implementing what's called the court packing plan. Basically, it made it so that justices over 70 years old could have additional justices appointed to join them. Basically, what it would have done is it would have increased the size of the Supreme Court for practical purposes from 9 justices to 13, and therefore FDR could implement his New Deal programs and have justices, these new justices who he would appoint, that were more amenable to the New Deal and more believed in more wide use of the Commerce Clause. The plan was widely unpopular amongst both citizens and members of Congress. FDR is heavily criticized for attempting to usurp the power or diminish the power of a co-equal branch of government. But the court, at least in some respects, and in addition to the appointment of new justices as some of the older ones retire, seems to have responded to the threat in a way that helps the New Deal and FDR's aspirations. In 1937, it reversed a series of its anti-New Deal decisions, concluding that Congress had the authority to legislate in any area so long as it was related in some way or affected commerce. It upheld, amongst other New Deal programs, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which made legal collective bargaining. The FLSA, collective bargaining, is bargaining between unions and business owners. The FSLA, Fair Labor Standards Act, set the federal minimum wage. The AAA, which had previously been ruled unconstitutional, was passed again in 1938, providing crop subsidies. Congress went on to use this power in a number of new areas. Prior to the New Deal, most political scientists likened the federal system to a layered cake. In other words, each the level of government, the national, state, and local level, were able to do certain things in certain policy areas. Each layer of government had clearly defined powers and responsibilities. After the New Deal, they started to refer to the government as more of a marble cake. A quote from a political scientist described it like this: "Whenever you slice through it, it reveals an inseparable mixture of differently colored ingredients. Vertical and diagonal lines almost obliterate the horizontal ones, and in some places there are unexpected swirls or whirls and an imperceptible merging of colors, so that it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins." And by that, they basically mean this: the intertwined relationship between the national, state, and local governments that begins with the New Deal makes it pretty indistinguishable who's doing what job. It shifts powers from the state to the national government. For instance, the New Deal, the federal government exerts an extraordinary amount of power in areas that previously would have been thought the domain of the states. And then again during the Great Society, where LBJ and his government sought to shift power from the states to the federal government. FDR's New Deal increased the flow of federal dollars to the states as well. During World War II, even more federal programs were introduced. By the 1950s and 60s, what we call federal grant and aid programs, so these are grants, were well entrenched, meaning that the federal government was giving money to the states to do certain things. They often defined the federal-state relationship and made the national government a major player in domestic policy based on how much money they were giving to certain grant and aid programs. In the 1960s, things start to change a little bit. As prior to the 1960s, you basically had the federal grant and aid programs in such a way that they were basically based on cooperations with states and designed to assist them with protecting the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens in those states. They were what are called as categorical grants that basically allocated federal funds to states for specific purposes, but they were more hands-off prior to the 1960s. In the 1960s, things start to change as LBJ, through his Great Society and War on Poverty, attempts to combat poverty and discrimination by channeling funds not just to states and local governments, but even directly to citizen action groups in an attempt to work around resistance they might have gotten at the state or local government level. But they were attempting to alleviate social ills that states had been unable or unwilling to remedy. Programs like urban renewal programs, education programs, poverty programs, including Head Start and job training, giving funds to local groups, allowed them to bypass, as I mentioned before, conservative state legislatures and mayors and city councils who were perceived as disinclined to help the poor, often African American communities and constituencies. These grants altered the old grant balance by furthering national, not state needs. Previously, categorical grants were used to help states achieve their own policy ends. Now, these grants, oftentimes bypassing the states altogether, were seeking to meet national, not state needs. These grants based on what the states wanted or needed declined, while grants based on national goals increase. From pollution to economic development and law enforcement, grants seemed like a perfect solution from the federal government's perspective and the liberal perspective for every problem. That said, not all federal programs mandating state and local action came with federal money attached, and that's going to cause a whole new level of resistance that we'll talk about in later sections. But to close out this section, what you should do is think about the presentation that we just went through and answer essential question number 17. How did cooperative federalism lead to the growth of the national government? How did cooperative federalism, New Deal, Great Society federalism, lead to the growth of the national government?